Ladies and gentlemen, last time we talked about Stalin, Hitler, and the road to World War. Specifically, we analyzed Nazi ideology and its inherent hostility to Bolshevism, to the Soviet Union, to Russians as an ethnic group, and to all the Slavs. We talked about the inconsistency, which in some ways still perplexes me, in Soviet policy toward the Nazis, and the decision, the fateful decision on the 22nd of August 1939 to sign the Nazi-Soviet Pact. At the end of the lecture, we talked about what the Soviet Union did in its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, in the Baltic states, in Finland, and in Poland. And at the end, the very end, I discussed how to interpret Soviet diplomacy. It seems to me that the Soviet account, which was current in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, that Stalin's behavior was rational, that he did the only thing he could do in the signing of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, and that he used the time well to prepare for invasion by the Nazis. This theory, it seems to me, falls to pieces under the scrutiny of other historians. Neckrich and Geller are two of the main critics of this theory. Now, what we will discuss today is the USSR at war. War on the Soviet front was awful and destructive. It seems to me that one cannot encompass the story of the war in a single lecture, and I rather doubt that one can encompass it in prose. There's a 19th century historian, brilliant historian and legendary lecturer named François Guizot, who was once applauded by his students for his outstanding lectures on French history. And Guizot said rather arrogantly and airily, "Do not applaud me, for it is history that speaks through me." Well, this kind of arrogance, I confess to you, is something that I do not share. I do not think that a humble historian can convey the experience of warfare in linear prose. I do not think that prose in general speaks the language of twistedness and death and destruction of the kind that was experienced by the Soviet peoples between 1941 and 1945. One could make a case that musicians like Shostakovich in the 7th Symphony or the 9th Symphony might have conveyed something about the war. The 7th Symphony, which was played during the war, is supposed to capture something about the horror of the invasion and something about the spirit of the heroic Soviet defenders. The 9th Symphony, which was commissioned by Stalin at the end of the war as a kind of victory symphony, it was supposed to be as grand as Beethoven's 9th, was a disappointing one, because what you hear is a sorrow in the strings and in the horns, a sorrow that sometimes descends to the bottom of the earth. Maybe the poets can capture something of the horror of the war because of their concision of language. What I can do is just scratch the surface. Let me try. The Nazis prepared carefully for their invasion of the Soviet Union. By June of 1941, they had between 3 and 4 million troops in their sphere of influence in Poland, readying an invasion force. Daily, the German Luftwaffe overflew Soviet territory, scouting out the defensive preparations, or in some cases the lack thereof, on the Soviet side. I mentioned last time that there were many warnings to Stalin about an impending invasion. The master spy Richard Sorge, who worked out of Tokyo and therefore had access to privileged information from the Japanese ally of the Nazis, reported in greater and greater detail in his dispatches about the Nazi preparations, and he even named the day and the hour of the attack. Stalin wrote on this dispatch, "To be filed." Winston Churchill warned through his ambassadorial corps and in a personal statement to Stalin that the Germans were going to invade. Sumner Welles, the American diplomat acting on instructions from Franklin Roosevelt, reported in detail about American knowledge of the impending invasion. Stalin dismissed all of these reports. So somehow on the 22nd of June 1941, Soviet forces in the field were caught unprepared. The invasion by the Nazis was launched. People in the forward units of the army of the Soviet Union were overrun. They did not return fire because there were no instructions from headquarters that told them to return fire. This is unbelievable. What do 3 and 4 million troops sitting on your border mean to your government? I mean, are they sitting out there eating their rations, having a grand old time and drinking café au lait? I rather think not. But history, stranger than fiction, tells us that this is what happened. We can compare the lack of preparedness of the Soviets to the lack of American preparedness maybe at Pearl Harbor, except that this Nazi invasion was much grander. It wasn't an air attack, which was easily screened. It was a massive force of invasion, so the scale, the size of the invasion really invalidates the comparison. Inside the Soviet government in June of 1941, there are all sorts of stories which suggest a kind of chaos and panic at the highest levels of the administration. Army planners lost contact with frontline units, which have been overrun, in many cases destroyed. Other units who were under bombardment started to return fire, nevertheless didn't communicate effectively with the center. So for a time the Soviets didn't know where their troops were, whether they were in danger, what were the prospects of defense, and so on. There was an arrogance also on the part of the Soviets. They assumed that their own propaganda was correct, that the invasion would be rebuffed. The Soviet Union was a socialist state. A socialist state is a superior state. A socialist state cannot be beaten by a capitalist state. And therefore, Stalin, in his first commands of the war, says, do not retreat. And yet, this is like holding back a hurricane. The German blitzkrieg was, in the first months of the war, almost uncontested because of the inability of the Soviets to muster defenses at the appropriate places, because of the chaos that the invasion caused. There were mass movements of Soviet peoples to the east away from the invasion zone in some places. And of course this complicated military communications. Khrushchev, in his various denunciations of Stalin, tells the story of Stalin's personal panic. At one point in late June, Stalin retired to his dacha, his personal headquarters outside of the capital, and he refused to come out for several days. And finally, people in the Politburo and in the military command went to fetch him, and when they arrived on the scene, it is said that Stalin had a surprised look on his face. He thought that they had come to arrest him, evidently. And when he realized that they hadn't, his response was drunken. Incidentally, he liked sweet, fruity Georgian wine. His drunken reply was, "Everything that Lenin did, we have sent to shit." Sorry, but those are the words that are reported. If you look at the war strategically, I am not by specialty a military historian, but it seems to me that you can make the case that the war falls into two phases. First phase probably lasted from the invasion date, 22nd of June 41, until the 31st of January 1943. This was the end of the Battle of Stalingrad. So from invasion to the Battle of Stalingrad. During this period, first part of it, Soviet armies were in constant retreat. Late in the fall of 1941, they managed at various places to stabilize defensive perimeters. Now, in terms of casualties inflicted in this period and prisoners taken, the Germans continually got the better of the fight until things equalized roughly at the Battle of Stalingrad. Stalingrad was a crucial moment in the war. It was the battle that militarily probably decided the war on the Eastern Front and maybe decided the fate of the Nazi regime. From September of 42 until late in January 43, the Germans and the Soviets both threw enormous numbers of troops into a relatively confined geographical area, which was strategically crucial for both sides to control, and which was psychologically crucial because Hitler, against the advice of his military, refused to retreat. He wanted to beat the Soviets at Stalingrad at that point. And of course, on the Soviet side, there was equal determination. The second phase of the war strategically was arguably the period from early February of 1943, that is, immediately following the German defeat at Stalingrad, until May of 1945, the end from the Soviet point of view of the European War and of the World War. There was a steady Soviet advance. The Soviets routed the Germans at the Battle of Kursk, which was also a very large battle in July and August of 43. By the spring of 1944, Soviet troops had succeeded in expelling the Nazis from Soviet territory. So now the war would be waged on the outside, in the Baltic states, in Poland, and eventually in Germany. The Soviets won a victory in Poland, in the central part of Poland, in August of 1944 and January of 1945. In that period, they gained control of Poland. And from then on, they inexorably, slowly, powerfully marched toward Berlin. And they managed to run their flag up the German Capitol building in May of 1945. The picture of that flag raising, incidentally, where the red flag went up, there is similar in its iconic significance to the raising of the American flag in Iwo Jima. So it's obviously an unposed shot. It's done by a very good photographer, and it captures something about the spirit of the moment. Now, that's the war strategically, according to an amateur military historian, somebody like me. The losses, well, let us count. 700 Soviet cities were partially or totally destroyed. Novgorod, the ancient city, was about 85% destroyed. Kiev, about 90% destroyed. Leningrad was bombarded from the air. Some individual buildings were destroyed by fire. On the outskirts of Leningrad, the little place called Pavlovsk, had the old Gatchina castle, was completely destroyed and had to be rebuilt by Soviet artisans. About 1,700 towns in the invasion zone were partially or totally destroyed. 70,000 villages, partially or totally destroyed. 30,000 factories, many of them big factories in the invasion zone, were destroyed, either bombardment or they were looted by the Germans for machinery and parts when the invaders turned into occupiers. Estimates of death and war casualties are staggering. Soviet Union published during the war no casualty figures. That was a closely held military secret. After the war, the first estimate that was made by the Soviets was that 7 million people in the army and out had died. This number was, I think, deliberately kept low because Stalin and the Soviet leadership calculated that in the context of the Cold War, which in their minds meant the potential of an American invasion of the Soviet Union, high casualty figures would indicate weakness on the part of the civilian structure, the economy, and also the army. And Soviets had no interest in showing themselves to the world as weak. The latest estimates by two reliable British historians in a very good book on the domestic front in the Soviet war, these historians are named Barber and Harrison, is this: 9 million Soviet soldiers died during the war. 9 million soldiers. 4.7 million roughly in POW camps, that is in Nazi captivity, and the remainder were killed in the field of battle. Many more civilians died during the war, however, than soldiers. Barber and Harrison think that the best estimate is 19 million civilians died in the war. So added up, 9 plus 19, that's 28 million people. That's on top of all the people that were purged, the victims of Ukrainian famine, and so on and so forth. This was a bloodbath beyond bloodbaths. 1 in 8 Soviet people were killed in the war. This means mathematically that every family that had a couple of siblings, would likely have someone killed. Every family knew someone that was killed. There were many millions more who were maimed, who came back from the war, not with the trophies that don't matter, this shining chandelier, which a peasant couldn't do anything with anyway, that bauble, or this nice bottle of schnapps, but with wounds, crippling wounds, and wounds in the mind. There is a wonderful book by the Soviet psychiatrist and neuroscientist Luria about his work with one Soviet war veteran who was wounded with a head wound and tried to recover all of his functions. Luria was a genius, did everything he could to revive this man's memory, give him control over his life, but this is one man out of the many, many thousands that returned a victim of the war. I must tell you that in 1985, I became friends with a Soviet family, and a young woman told me, look, on Victory Day, my father won't talk with anybody. This is 9th of May when Soviets celebrated the victory, the taking of Berlin, Victory Over Fascism Day. My father was a front soldier, and on that day he simply meets with his friends, and mostly they sit in silence. And when they talk amongst themselves. And they tell me, this was now a grown woman with whom I was discussing the matter, they tell me that it's too horrible to talk about what happened at the front and that I wouldn't understand in any case. Let me rehearse briefly again something about episodes in the war. I don't think an overview of the war can convey it. I mean, war is individual acts and experiences. A brilliant filmmaker could capture one vignette, one tableau that would convey more than I can convey with words. Well, let me try, though, to capture certain episodes. The war was barbarous in character, and not the least barbarous moment was that very early on in the war, the Nazi invaders used paramilitary forces that followed the army in to Russia to cleanse ethnically the Soviet territories that were invaded. That means that the Holocaust as mass killing begins on Soviet territory. In March of 1941, Hitler issued an order called the Kommissarordnung, the Commissar Order, to kill communists. But accompanying this was an oral instruction to kill Jews. And these instructions were to be carried out by military units in certain cases, but mostly by a group of paramilitary officers, between 3,000 and 4,000 in number, that the Nazis called the Einsatzgruppen. There were 4 of these Einsatzgruppen that were involved in the invasion effort. What they did was to round up the local populations that had to be eliminated, and they shot them to death. Now, the most famous, I should say infamous, incident in which the Einsatzgruppen were involved occurred at the ravine called Babi Yar outside of Kiev. At the end of September of 1941, 29th and 30th, and on the 1st of October. 30th of September is my birthday. That's how I remember this. Jews from Kiev were marched out to Babi Yar. They were made to undress, to walk to the edge of a ravine, to stand in rows, and then they were shot by members of the Einsatzgruppen. On one day, about 30,000 people were killed, toppled one after another into the graves. All in all, over these 3 days, about 50,000 people, most of them Jews, perished. There were some communists that were also killed at Babi Yar. By the end of 1942, about 1.4 million Soviet Jews had been killed. I said that in the time the war began, there were 2.7 million Jews on Soviet territory. 1.4 had been killed, millions, by the end of 1942, so over half. Many of the Jews who were not dead were ghettoized. That is, they were concentrated from the countryside in Jewish quarters of various Soviet towns. There was, according to one estimate, about 130 such ghettos on Soviet territory. And at some point, these ghettos were emptied by transporting the Jews there to the death camps in Poland, to Auschwitz and so on and so forth. It was known at the time that this was going on. Vasily Grossman and Ilya Ehrenburg were collecting documents and trying to make this publicly known that killing of Jews was going on Soviet territory. That's one episode. And then there is the Siege of Leningrad. It's another amazing episode of the war. Hitler decided, for symbolic reasons, I think, that the city of Leningrad, I guess I'll quote him, would be razed from the face of the earth. It is proposed to blockade the city closely, the Fuhrer wrote, and by means of artillery fire and ceaseless bombardment from the air to raze it from the ground. If this creates a situation, I'm still quoting, in the city which produces calls for surrender, they will be refused, end quote. He was going to kill everybody in Leningrad and destroy the city utterly. Why? Because it was the cradle of communism, and therefore symbolically it had to be obliterated. Hitler was terrifyingly literal in his thinking. The cradle of Bolshevism could not be allowed to exist. What happened was not the razing of the city of Leningrad and not the surrender. What happened was that the Nazi armies approached the outskirts of Leningrad. They met with a fierce defense from Leningraders. The invasion force was stopped, and instead of razing the city, what Hitler decided to do was blockade it. So from the fall of 1941 until early in 1944, for about 900 days, the Nazis blockaded the city and attempted to strangle it, to starve out the inhabitants. They took care in the initial days of this blockade to bombard the grain warehouses, the Badaev warehouses where the city's supply of flour and unmilled grains was kept. Now here, if anything, folks, is a disadvantage of centralized government. In other societies, grain stores are not centralized. They are distributed all over the place because they're in the control of private people. Or government is decentralized in such a way that you don't put all of your foodstuffs in one place. The Soviets wanted control over food because food is a weapon against the dissenter internally as much as something that enables one to survive. And here centralization worked against the Soviet system. What did this mean in human terms? It meant that food rationing was imposed. A city of 2.5 million people had to be fed on the equivalent of 30 railroad car loads of grain a day. The daily food ration was set at 250 grams for factory workers. That's about 4 slices of bread a day. 125 grams for everybody else. It means if you were an intellectual, you got 2 slices of grain a day. Soldiers in the field around Leningrad, incidentally, got about 500 grams. That's something like a half a loaf of the dark rye bread that Russians love so much. Now soon, lest the supply of grain be exhausted, the authorities were mixing what they called edible cellulose with the grain. Now what does edible cellulose mean? It's sawdust. Cellulose, if you check your nutrition, is something that you cannot digest, but of course in the stomach it makes you feel full. Now as if the food situation wasn't dire, it was, because this kind of rationing doomed tens of thousands of people to starvation if the blockade continued. The winter of 41-42 was the coldest winter in 40 years, and one of the two coldest winters in a century. Temperatures dropped that winter to 40 below zero. I can tell you, I lived through a Leningrad winter one time where the temperatures were 25 to 30 below zero, and I had to walk across a long bridge at the mouth of the Neva, and I felt that chill wind. I wasn't a starving person, so I survived, but I thought, good Lord, help me get to the other side. I mean, I thought I wouldn't make it. There were thick coatings of ice inside public buildings because fuel oil was being economized. Private apartments were unheated. Strange thing happened in a lot of these apartments. They were centrally heated, state-controlled heat too, you know. Some people constructed out of scraps of iron little pot-bellied stoves that they called bourgeoisie, little bourgeois, because they were rather fat in the middle, vented them out the wall. Some people forgot about the venting and they asphyxiated themselves. And they burned in these bourgeoisie books, furniture, anything that would burn to keep themselves warm. So ultimately it didn't help because there wasn't enough combustible commodity available. So people froze as well as starved. In the winter of 41-42, people didn't change their clothes. Their bodies were covered by lice. And this was just the facts of life. In this winter, there was mass starvation and death. The demographers tell us, there are people interested in these grisly things, males, adult males, tended to starve first. Females, for some reason, in famine situations, tend to die later than males. So there was a disproportionate number of males that starved. Then children, young children, and then women. Now, so many people starved. Harrison Salisbury tells us, he's written a nice book, 900 Days, about this episode in Leningrad, but it's also in any number of diaries that you can read by survivors. So many people died that it got beyond the capacity of the funeral industry to remove all of the corpses. So corpses were brought down out of apartments and just stacked on the sidewalk until later, at some point, somebody would come and haul them away. Some people couldn't stand the sight of those corpses, so they made little sleds and they stacked a corpse or two on it and pulled it to the cemetery. At Piskarevskaya Kladbyshe, the Piskarevsky cemetery in the middle of Leningrad, there are mass graves holding the bodies of about 600,000 Leningraders, many of whom starved to death in that winter. About 20,000 yards of mass graves were dug in the city over the course of the winter. I can't leave this without mentioning one thing of relevance to Cold War politics. A young girl named Tanya Savicheva kept a diary. She recorded the deaths of her family. 12th of December, Zhenya died. On 25th of January, 42, Babushka umerla, grandmother died. On 17th of March, brother Leka died. On 13th of April, Uncle Vasya died. On 10th of May, Uncle Lesha died. On the 13th of May at 7:30 in the morning, umerla, Mama died. And the last two heartbreaking pages of the diary say simply, Savichevi umerli vsya. The Savichevs have died. Everyone has died. Of course, Tanya herself succumbed. When Richard Nixon went to the Soviet Union to negotiate the policy basket that we call the détente arrangements, he mentioned Tanya's diary. And he said, we remember, we Americans, the suffering that has occurred in the Soviet Union in the war. We remember little Tanya, and we hope that this will never happen again. Now, I don't know how Nixon found the right words, but these were the right words in this situation. They spoke directly to the hearts of Russian people. Let me mention Stalingrad. I alluded to it already. It was the largest battle in the history of civilization in terms of the number of troops committed. In terms of the number of dead, 150,000 Germans died, roughly. 50,000 Germans were wounded. There were about 90,000 Nazi prisoners taken. Soviet losses, in terms of death and casualties, were higher than that of the Germans. Now, there is something that happened after the Stalingrad invasion that y'all might not know about, but is interesting. It tells us about part of the world that we don't ponder, maybe often enough. The bones of the German dead and the bones of the Soviet dead. There were so many of them over such a wide territory that they could not be collected and buried if the will to do so was there. This was a massive killing field. And so, an Austrian journalist who in the days of Perestroika went to the Soviet Union and was permitted, it's a rare permission, permitted to go and look at Stalingrad, saw to his shock that as far as the eye could see, there were bones protruding out of the ground. He went home and he wrote an article about this, and the right wing in Austria, and to a lesser extent in Germany, expressed their outrage. What, our war dead? Not buried properly? Now the Soviets, you can imagine with what little sympathy they viewed this kind of claim. And I must tell you, I'm on the Soviet side here. The Germans were uninvited invaders, and so let their bones rest in the sun. We must mention that in the war there were massive numbers of POWs on both sides. Now, for our purposes, I'm interested not in the German POWs, but in the Soviet ones. So I will tell you about what happened to them. What happened to them is that they were incarcerated in great numbers in the first part of the war and given very little food. They suffered from malnutrition. Many of them starved to death in these prison conditions in the Nazi camps. And the survivors plus later victims who fell into the Nazi occupiers' hands were forced to do hard labor. I met at Stanford an old Russian, by then he was old, a survivor of the Nazi POW camps, and he said, you know, you just can't believe the conditions. He said he himself almost died of dysentery. Everyone in his unit that he knew perished from dysentery. He was the lone survivor. This was a terrible episode in the war. Why were the Nazis so brutal? Well, they thought that each of these Soviet POWs might be communist, and therefore they were ideologically suspect. We must also not leave the subject of the war without mentioning another topic. And this is a topic that really is sensitive. It gets under the skin of Soviets and Russians. It is the question of collaboration with the Nazis. In some places, we're not talking about everywhere, but in some places, particularly in the Baltic states and also in Ukraine, the Nazi invasion was welcomed at first. They were greeted with flowers by some Ukrainian women, greeted with bread and salt by some Ukrainian peasants, and there were many Ukrainians, also some Balts and other folk, that willingly collaborated with the Nazi occupiers in the first stages of the war. How could that be, you say to yourself, to collaborate with an invader? Well, the answer from these people's perspective, now I'm not being a judge here, I'm just trying to report their perspective, is that the Soviets were invaders. From the point of view of people in the Baltic states, they had suffered by 1941 under Soviet power. Their independent country had been destroyed by the Soviet army and the NKVD. So they welcomed the Nazis as liberators. In Ukraine, people had suffered under the terror famine, and they remembered, and so they were only too glad to shuck off Stalin and Soviet authorities. Of course, what they discovered is that they exchanged one bad master for another bad master, maybe even a worse one. In the POW camps, Soviet POW camps on German territory, there was the case of a general, a man called Vlasov, who actually volunteered to organize a military unit to fight against the Soviet Union. Now, Hitler at first rejected this notion. Vlasov made this offer in 1943, and Hitler rejected it out of hand. I mean, what, you know, these are Untermenschen. They're not even Hilfsleute. They're not auxiliary peoples. We cannot have them helping us. But at the lower levels, the Nazi people in charge of the POW camp pressed the case that, well, it couldn't hurt. We'll keep them on a tight leash. And actually, at the end of the war, there were Vlasovite units led by Vlasov under German control, that fought against the Soviets. And this is so bitter. I mean, this is beyond Benedict Arnold's treachery that we all learn about in the history books. A Soviet general, somebody that had party approval, turning with Soviet troops against the state. I mean, ideologically, the Soviets just couldn't stomach this. And the reasons for Vlasov's treachery were perhaps, and this is what is most horrifying from the Soviet perspective, were perhaps that he fought not because of sympathy for racial superiority, a la Hitler, but rather to have the possibility of a Russia free of Soviet control. In other words, maybe Vlasov was a nationalist. That's a lot of ideological baggage to stomach. Keep in mind that, Vlasovite or not, all Soviet POWs, whether they escaped or whether they were simply repatriated after the war, were assumed to be collaborators with the Nazis. Part of this story we'll tell next time. Finally, I must mention the plight of the so-called punished peoples. These were peoples who were suspected, rightly or wrongly, at various stages of the war, of collaborating with the Nazis. The Volga Germans were relocated to the east because they were ethnically German and therefore assumed to be sympathetic with the Nazis. And their plight's very like the plight of the California Japanese in this country who were put in intern camps. In 1943-44, Crimean Tatars and 5 small peoples of the Caucasus were relocated on Stalin's orders from their homelands. The Balkars, the Chechens, whose names are in the news, the Ingushi, the Kalmyks, the Karachay, were all relocated. And after the war, many of them were not allowed to return to their homelands. So, ladies and gentlemen, the war is a war of grand strategy. It's a war of countless casualties, but above all, it's a war of episodes, some of which I would prefer, if I were not a historian, even to think about.